Burkina Faso's voice had been lost abroad for decades, but Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not wait for permission, nor did he seek applause. On a dry August morning in Ouagadougou, he stepped up to the microphones, and within minutes, he rewrote the rules. For 27 long years, the voice of Burkina Faso traveled across oceans before reaching its own people. It was routed through foreign servers, filtered by corporate contracts, and often silenced during times of unrest. In 2021, a 72-hour blackout made that reality painfully clear. Hospitals in rural towns were cut off from communication. Families were separated across provinces, and an entire nation saw just how fragile a borrowed signal truly was. That memory hardened into resolve. And when Traoré announced the launch of Faso Telecom, he did not present it as an experiment or a pilot program. He framed it as a sovereign switch, flipped by Burkinabe hands. This was not charity, nor dependency. The network was built by local engineers, financed without IMF loans, without World Bank credit lines, and without Western grants. It was operated entirely on domestic infrastructure, designed to withstand heat, dust, and Sahel storms. Behind him stood teams of young men and women who had laid 4,200 kilometers of fiber, raised 65 ground-based satellite stations, and built a firewall tuned to erratic power and desert grit. Their average age was barely 32. Their experience was not imported. It was forged in urgency, on home soil, where failure meant another decade of silence, and success meant a generation would finally speak freely. This was not just a technical achievement. It was a declaration that digital colonization ends here, that Burkina Faso would carry its voice across borders without first leaving the continent. In only 22 minutes, the last strands of dependency were cut. A network lit up, now reaching 92% of the population, from border villages to the capital's busiest districts. Yet the statistics are only the surface. Beneath them lies a question that vibrates far beyond West Africa, unsettling boardrooms that once enjoyed unquestioned access. If a landlocked nation, with modest GDP and decades of imposed dependency, can build and defend its own signal without foreign oversight, what becomes of the global order that demanded patience and permission? Is this the beginning of durable digital sovereignty, or the first move in a confrontation the world is not prepared to face? And when history is written, which side will it say drew first? Faso Telecom was not a sketch on a whiteboard, nor a promise in a policy speech. It was a functioning sovereign 2B network, built entirely by local hands and ready to serve a nation of 22 million. The numbers spoke with precision. 4,200 kilometers of fiber optic cable laid across hills, deserts, and rocky plains. 65 ground-based satellite stations constructed entirely inside Burkina Faso's borders. National coverage reaching 92% of the population. Every piece of infrastructure was tailored to local realities. Towers built to resist Saharan heat, cables sheathed against dust storms, and relays calibrated to endure erratic electricity and sudden floods. This was not the work of foreign contractors flown in for ribbon cuttings. It was the product of 647 Burkinabe engineers and technicians, 83% of them under 35, trained in Ouagadougou and Koudougou, often in training facilities that had not even existed 18 months earlier. Funding came from deliberate national choices. Military spending once used to host foreign troops was redirected into domestic infrastructure. Gold royalties were renegotiated and retained, and a telecommunications sovereignty fund, established in 2023, pooled fees once paid to overseas carriers. The result was a project built without IMF loans, without World Bank disbursements, without European credit lines, and without the oversight that so often comes attached. Every line of code running the network's management software was written locally, optimized for Sahel conditions global templates would overlook. From dusty border towns to flood-prone lowlands, every subscriber's connection was encrypted, with a proprietary algorithm developed by the National Cryptography Division. Encryption keys were stored not in Paris or New York, but on servers housed in a Tier 4 data center west of the capital, capable of handling 5 million concurrent connections. This was an intentional rejection of the old order. For 27 years, a French conglomerate had controlled the telecom backbone, hosted Burkina Faso's data in Paris, routed traffic through European nodes, and even cut entire provinces off during political protests. In just 14 months, that dependency was dismantled. Contracts were terminated, licenses revoked. Even the operational license of TASA was stripped away, a move that rattled markets in Paris. The revocations followed 2 years of failed negotiations over data sovereignty, and when the final decree was signed, 72 hours before the public launch, it became clear that Burkina Faso was not merely upgrading its telecoms. It was reclaiming ownership. International headlines swung between praise and alarm. Some called it a quiet African revolution. Others warned of unchecked state control. But the government framed it differently, as the restoration of a right that should never have been outsourced. The network's reach extended far beyond the capital. Over 1,500 rural villages were connected. High-speed internet arrived in areas where signals had once been faint and unreliable. In border communes like Majawari and Tinikoff, field tests returned download speeds of over 22 megabits per second. Unthinkable only a few years ago. Engineers configured the system with open-source protocols adapted for local needs. Load balancing. Algorithms were tuned to Sahel weather patterns. Cooling systems were designed from local materials. Ground telemetry was overseen by the Sahel Telecommunications Brigade, an elite unit of former electrical engineering students trained to maintain military-grade infrastructure under extreme conditions. No foreign cloud hosted the keys. No overseas data center cached a single packet. Every bit of Burkinabe data remained within Burkinabe borders. This was as much psychology as it was technology. A message to the people that their voice would no longer leave the continent before reaching their neighbor. In classrooms, in clinics, in markets, and in ministries, the effect was immediate. The wires now belonged to those who walked the streets they connected. This was the main event, not because it was spectacular, but because it was irreversible. A line drawn in code, cable, and conviction, reshaping not only how a nation connects, but how it is seen. The climax came when President Traoré faced the press and declared in steady, measured tones, "From this day forward, the voice of Burkina Faso will not leave the continent before it reaches its neighbor." That statement carried more weight than any technical briefing. It resonated like a declaration of independence in the digital age. Inside the press hall, reporters exchanged glances. Engineers stood silent in the back rows. Security officers shifted only slightly beneath the Sahel sun, sensing the magnitude of the moment. Outside, the decree spread quickly. Within hours, the Paris Stock Exchange saw shares of Telecom plunge. The reality of a 27-year grip on Burkina Faso's telecom, backbone being severed, finally sinking in. This was no sudden act of political theater. It was the culmination of years of frustration. Foreign control, contested audits, refusals to comply with sovereignty laws. The final executive order, signed just 72 hours before launch, stripped all foreign telecom companies of operational licenses and rendered their contracts void. The legal maneuver sent shockwaves through Europe's corporate and diplomatic circles. Backlash followed swiftly. Luxembourg-based Helionet filed for arbitration, demanding $276 million in damages for breach of contract. But Burkina Faso's Ministry of Justice replied with a single-page statement. They would not negotiate the return of what was always theirs. With that sentence, the argument shifted, from commerce to reclamation. International media scrambled. The Guardian warned of unregulated control. CNN Africa questioned centralization. The Economist asked openly whether Burkina Faso could be trusted with its own data. Across Africa, reactions were mixed. In Dar es Salaam, commentators called it the first diplomatic firewall. In Cotonou, analysts warned of regional shifts. In Nairobi, editorial boards debated its impact on Pan-African bandwidth agreements. In the rural highlands, children who once walked hours to reach a community radio station now logged into Faso Learn through solar-powered devices. Their lessons were taught in their own dialects, automatically marked and stored securely on national servers in Manga. In remote clinics, nurses conducted live consultations with doctors hundreds of kilometers away. Calls were encrypted, free from third-party review, allowing medical advice to flow without the delay and intrusion that had once been standard. Farmers received agricultural forecasts through push notifications timed to planting cycles based on domestic satellite data. No longer relying on rumors or delayed word-of-mouth updates, They now planted with precision, improving yields and reducing waste. Religious leaders sent encrypted community bulletins reaching nomadic groups in seconds, bridging distances that once took days to cover, and doing so without passing through foreign-owned infrastructure. This shift was not only technical, it was psychological. It reinforced the belief that essential services and communications could be owned, operated, and defended entirely within Burkina Faso. Politically, the move reset the terms of negotiation with foreign powers. Contracts were now reviewed under the assumption that national law came first. Infrastructure clauses were scrutinized for their sovereignty implications before any signatures were given. Opposition parties found themselves in a delicate position. They could not openly criticize an achievement with such visible benefits, yet they remained wary of the concentration of control in state hands. This tension fueled debates in parliament, but it did not alter the trajectory of policy. Internationally, Burkina Faso gained a new form of leverage, not based on mineral wealth or military alliances, but on control over a network that no external actor could switch off. This altered its standing in regional organizations, giving it both a voice and a veto in discussions on shared infrastructure, cybersecurity frameworks, and cross-border bandwidth treaties. Civil society groups quickly explored how Faso Telecom's secure channels could be integrated into election monitoring, disaster response, and anti-corruption reporting, recognizing that the same protections shielding data from foreign interception could also safeguard it from domestic abuse if proper oversight was enforced. The political class, meanwhile, faced a new reality. No longer could promises of development be tied to foreign-funded connectivity projects. The narrative of dependency had been broken in a way that could not easily be reversed. For some, this was welcomed as the maturation of national governance. For others, it was seen as a challenge to entrenched patronage systems that had relied on external funding to maintain influence. The symbolic weight of the shift appeared in small but telling details. New legislation mandating all government data be hosted domestically, public schools teaching network architecture in national languages, alongside mathematics and history. International donors, once dictating technical terms, now attended only as observers. Multinational corporations were forced to adapt to a legal environment where compliance meant submitting to Burkinabe security audits. For ordinary citizens, the most important change was a feeling that the wires, towers, and codes carrying their voices belonged to them, that no distant boardroom could ever again decide to silence them. This sense of ownership began shaping civic engagement. Local governance forums saw higher participation. Public scrutiny of infrastructure spending intensified. The people were not just connected to the internet. They were connected to the idea that connection itself was both a right and a responsibility. Politically and socially, Faso Telecom had shifted the ground beneath both the government and the governed, creating a new baseline from which future conflicts, alliances, and reforms would be measured. From Washington's perspective, Faso Telecom's emergence was both a challenge and an opportunity. A geopolitical development forcing a recalibration of long-standing assumptions about Africa's place in the digital order. For decades, U.S. officials had viewed Sahelian telecommunications infrastructure as either a Western domain or a contested arena with China. But the sudden rise of a fully sovereign, domestically engineered network disrupted that binary. Analysts at the U.S. Commerce Department voiced concerns about spectrum governance and interoperability, specifically whether American firms could ever integrate with a system built entirely outside their standards. Defense circles quietly noted the implications for intelligence gathering in a region where open lines had once been taken for granted. American tech companies, meanwhile, saw contracts slipping away, not to Western competitors, but to a model that bypassed them entirely, relying instead on domestic innovation and South-South partnerships. Europe reacted with similar unease. For France, the shock was sharper. The loss of Burkina Faso's telecom sector symbolized a deeper erosion of influence across its former colonies. An erosion made worse by the speed and finality of the license revocations. In Brussels, EU officials debated whether sovereign networks like Faso Telecom should be treated as barriers to trade. But in African Union meetings, the tone was very different. Delegates from smaller economies began asking whether the Burkinabe model could be replicated, adapted, and scaled across the continent. In Asia, nations like India and Indonesia expressed interest in technical exchanges, recognizing parallels with their own efforts to localize data storage and reduce foreign dependency. For global telecom corporations, Faso Telecom's rise was a warning. The African market was no longer guaranteed. Where political will and technical capacity converged, foreign dominance could be replaced. For Washington strategists, the deeper question became, should sovereign systems like Faso Telecom be engaged as partners or countered as adversarial infrastructures? In global public discourse, Faso Telecom became a touchstone in debates on digital sovereignty, cybersecurity, and the rights of nations to control their own networks. Should such rights be considered as fundamental as territorial borders? The conclusion of Faso Telecom's story is not an ending, but a signal still traveling. A signal that carries both a warning and a promise. It warns those who long treated African connectivity as a resource to be owned, that the age of unquestioned access is ending. That nations once dismissed as peripheral can now design, build, and defend their own systems. It promises those who have waited generations for self-determination that sovereignty is no longer abstract. It is practical, daily reality, coded into networks and etched into steel towers that rise from their own soil. Independence today is measured not only in land and laws, but in bandwidth, in encryption, and in who holds the keys to the servers that carry a nation's voice. If France can guard its nuclear grid, and if the United States can secure its banking software, why should Africa be told its digital backbone must remain in foreign hands? This moment challenges the old assumption that technical capacity flows only outward from the West. It replaces it with a new truth, that innovation can emerge anywhere, determination and purpose align. And it raises uncomfortable questions for the global order. Because if Burkina Faso can do this without asking, what else might follow? And how will those accustomed to control respond? For the people of Burkina Faso, the victory lies not only in the launch but in the quiet daily proof that the wires, the codes, the signals serve them first, that no distant authority can sever that bond without their consent. For those over 60, it echoes the struggles and triumphs of earlier independence movements, reminding the world that every generation must claim its own form of freedom. Share this message if you believe Africa's voice should never leave the continent before reaching its people, and subscribe if you believe the future must be coded by our own hands, because the signal now belongs to those who built it, and its strength will depend on how many choose to carry it forward.